You are listening to the Oddities of Violence podcast, a podcast about ideas and events from the margins of terrorism, genocide, and the philosophy of violence. This podcast is recorded at the CJSW 90.9 FM studios at the University of Calgary in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, located on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary, also called Mohkinstsis and Blackfoot, is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Your hosts are Gavin Cameron, Josh Goldstein, and Maureen Hebert. We're all on faculty here in the Department of Political Science. And just a caution before we get started, this podcast is for a mature audience and deals with topics, commentary, and depictions of events that some listeners may find difficult or distressing. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Oddities of Violence podcast. I'm your host, Maureen Hebert, and I'm joined, as usual, by my co-hosts, Gavin Cameron. Hi, Gavin.
Hi, Maureen.
And Josh Goldstein.
Hi, Maureen. Hi, Gavin.
Great to be in the studio with you again, Gavin and Josh. In this episode, we're probing the margins of genocide. We'll be having a conversation about empire, anxiety, and the oddities of extermination in the Roman Empire in the ancient world. Joining us today is one of our Oddities of Violence workshop contributors, Tristan Taylor. Tristan is a senior lecturer in classics and ancient history at the University of New England, Australia, and a research associate of the University of Tasmania, also in Australia. He holds a PhD in classics at Yale University and has been a visiting fellow in genocide studies at the Yale University Genocide Studies program in 2013 to 14, and a visiting scholar in classics at the University of Texas, Austin in 2015. His research focuses on mass violence in the ancient world, particularly in Greece and Rome. He is the editor of A Cultural History of Genocide, The Ancient World in 2021, and co-editor with Professors Tracy Lemons and Ben Kiernan of Volume 1 of the Cambridge World History of Genocide, forthcoming this year. Now, although Tristan lives and works in Armidale, New South Wales in Australia, he's joining us today from London, England. Hello, Tristan.
Hello. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to our conversation. Now, before we dive into the nitty-gritty of your arguments and cases and analyses, I'd like to step back just a bit and get a sense of your academic origin story. Now, I know that you didn't start your academic career in classics. In fact, you wrote your honors thesis on quota management in Australian fisheries. So how did you go from modern-day fisheries policies to the Romans and genocide in the ancient world?
Well, the foundation stone is Indiana Jones, which I hired so many times on VHS to show my age that my parents banned me from hiring it, which imbued in me a great love of the ancient world. So as an undergraduate, I did a combined degree where I was studying law and fishing quotas and classics at the same time. And while I studied law, I developed a great interest in international law, humanitarian law, human rights law, and was active in amnesty and things like that. And after some detours through environmental policy and so on, went off to do my PhD in classics. As part of the program, we were required to take 2 courses outside our focus. So I did one on Renaissance epic poetry, and browsing the course catalogue, I came across one on genocide, and that sort of seemed to mesh with my interest in human rights law and international law and history, because it was taught in the history program. And during that course, I was reading a book called American Holocaust that was about the colonization of South America. But one of my North American colleagues took some offense to the title. He didn't know what the content was. And he said, well, killing and enslaving 7 million Gauls, that's a Holocaust. And it started me thinking, well, what is the status of genocide in the ancient world? How do people think about it? And the particular example he was talking about was of Caesar's conquest in Gaul. And so I started looking into that and gave a paper at Yale, at my PhD program, about Caesar's genocide in Gaul, arguing that he did in fact do it. Um,
So that is a
and
real.
it sort of sat on the back burner for a while as I finished my PhD. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say that is a really interesting way to kind of get into genocide studies. But continue on. Go ahead.
Sat on the back burner for a while, and then after I finished my PhD, and when I was my first academic position was teaching in a law school, and I was looking for a research project that would meld sort of my legal interests with my historical interests, and that particular project leapt out to me and it sort of has gone from there. And I've been working on it now for some time, leading to the two edited volumes, which one of them does include a paper on Caesar in Gaul. So that has its genesis right back in that graduate school paper at a lunchtime seminar series.
Wow.
That is an excellent and super interesting trajectory. I think a good lesson to all young academics that you don't have to have it all planned out from beginning to end up with a really fascinating career. So let's turn now to your topic at hand here. So to orient our listeners who may not know, could you tell us a bit about how the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire came to be the hegemonic power in the Mediterranean world?
Oh, that's a long story. Rome's story of expansion begins in peninsular Italy, where through a series of alliances and war, it gradually expands what it calls its imperium, which is where we get the modern word empire. And what the Romans are interested in at that stage isn't necessarily directly controlling territory. It's about people owing obedience to the Romans, and in particular, providing them with money and or manpower to help them fight wars. Eventually, they come into conflict with Carthage, which was the other major power in the Western Mediterranean, in the island of Sicily. And this is what becomes the First Punic War in the early 3rd century BCE. Rome wins. Rome acquires Sicily as its first overseas possession, if you will, that it governs directly through a governor. And it gradually, always it claims in self-defense, develops allies. These allies come to conflict. Rome intervenes. A war occurs, and gradually its power expands throughout the Eastern Mediterranean as well. Initially, it emerges into Greece and claims for itself to be the liberator of Greece, and with great ceremony proclaims that Greece is now free from the Macedonian kingdoms that have ruled it since Alexander. But as the Greek leagues and city-states fight with each other, Rome intervenes more and more, and eventually brings Greece into its domain, and it receives a bequest of what is essentially most of modern-day Turkey from it, the king of the Pergamenes, who dies and bequeaths it to Rome. Mm. And of course, this territory brings it into conflict with other former Hellenistic kingdoms. Those are the very successors of Alexander the Great. Now, in the way Rome projects itself, it is always acting in defense of itself or its allies. And in the way Rome thinks about itself, its great success is due to the fact that they are the most pious of people in the Mediterranean, and the gods favor not only Rome itself, but Rome's acquisition of this domain. But it doesn't always govern directly. It's sort of the very later conception of the empire governing through provinces and governors develops very piecemeal. Its initial concern is essentially, do people respect Rome's power or not? Do they obey Rome's requests or not? And the final domino to fall is Egypt, the last of the Ptolemies, Cleopatra, in the anyone who's read Shakespeare or seen the Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton film knows what happens there. So Rome's projection of what it's doing and what Rome's actually doing. So they often very conveniently make an alliance when it's very clear that their ally is about to come into conflict with someone else. Mm. And that gives Rome the justification to intervene, but still the idea that they're just acting in self-defense or defense of their allies, because they're such pious and moral and upright people. So this process takes quite a long time. So we're talking about a couple of centuries between the victory over Carthage in the First Punic War and sort of 20 B, the 30s BCE, when they finally acquire Egypt. And various other parts are added on over the imperial period, but really Rome is the dominant force in the Mediterranean by sort of the mid-2nd century BCE.
So that is a perfect kind of setup for your particular contribution to our workshop. So you focus on specific cases of violence across centuries of conflict and warfare during the Roman period. As you've kind of alluded to, this includes the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage and the persecution many centuries later of Christian and Manichaean communities by Rome. So what were the central events in the history of these cases? And how did these fit into what you've already kind of described to us, these larger background events of conflict within the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire?
Yeah, so two I think important background things to have in mind in this is, first of all, the broader concept of how ancient empires worked, where they didn't so much rely on having military power in a particular everywhere all at once. They relied on their reputation. So, or the Latin term is existimatio, and the Romans talk about the existimatio, which is where we get estimation in English of the empire. And if the empire's reputation is harmed, if its honor is harmed, then that can reduce its standing and it can encourage people to revolt. So it's very important that Rome, even though it can't deploy violence everywhere all at once to support its power, if anyone ever diminishes its reputation or challenges it, they have to respond decisively, if you will, which means with a very large amount of force and violence to that, so that their reputation is maintained and other people are deterred from revolting. So that kind of thinking underlies a lot of what Rome does. So if an ally rebels or betrays Rome in some form, they will respond with significant violence. That usually means destroying the city, massacring the men, enslaving the women and children, and so on. So that's a very important facet of the way that they think. And it's not just unique to them. So I understand you talked about Milos recently in another podcast. That's very much how Athens is thinking in relation to Milos. This little island, how dare they stand outside the empire? We need to make an example of them, or else, and this is how Thucydides, the historian of that, speaks about it. But also, the Romans firmly believe that their success is intimately connected with their piety. And a great example of this is an anecdote from the First Punic War, the first time Rome and Carthage come into conflict, when Rome acquires Sicily as its first overseas possession or province. And there's a general who wants to go into a naval battle. He wants to get great glory in victory. But of course, they need to take the omens before they have a battle. And the omens in this case are sacred chickens. Do the sacred chickens eat or not? And the sacred chickens aren't hungry. And he's told, well, the chickens aren't eating. It's a bad omen. We shouldn't go into battle. And in sort of a Marie Antoinette fashion, he goes, well, let them drink, and throws the sacred chickens into the sea, goes into battle and loses horrendously. And this is kind of this moral tale. Well, he ignored the gods. If we Romans don't ignore the gods, so if we always need to keep them on side. And each of these two limbs, if you will, the need to maintain the empire's reputation and the fact that the success is built on divinity, those two limbs explain the two separate, vastly separated by times and incidents here, the persecution of the Christians on the one hand and Carthage on the other. But there's an extra sort of twist, if you will, to Carthage. Now, the way in which the Romans So the Romans fought two big wars with Carthage. The first one, they won, they got Sicily. The second one, they won eventually, but only after Hannibal had rampaged. This is with Hannibal, the elephants over the Alps, famous story, rampaged through Italy for many years, and eventually Rome wins. But there's a lingering feeling of humiliation, which is an important contributing factor in genocide. Generally, the psychological motivations of genocide, and also this fear of the Carthaginians, because no one had challenged Rome so successfully and no one will until the 3rd century, nearly 400 years later, 3rd century CE. But Rome won that war and imposed humiliating conditions on Carthage and disempowered Carthage significantly. And their justification for going to war with Carthage was Carthage breached one of the conditions of this peace treaty. And that was they made war with their neighbor, the Numidian kingdom, without Rome's permission. And part of Rome, the treaty was Carthage sort of lost that autonomy to go to war. They had to ask Rome's permission. Carthage lost, by the way. They fought this kingdom and they lost. But the Romans used that as a pretext for making war on Carthage. And as if you look at the way that the conflict escalates, the Carthaginians capitulate to every ultimatum Rome gives. It's like, give us hostages. Rome gives them hostages. Disarm yourselves. They disarm themselves. And everything Rome asks, until Rome asks, well, okay, you've done all these other things. Our last request is that you abandon your city and move 10 miles inland, which is the sort of the antithesis of what Carthage is. Carthage is a port city. It's a major emporium, relies on trading, relies on connections. It just won't be Carthage anymore. Not to mention the abandoning the shrines and the tombs and so on that would go with abandoning your city. So it's clear Rome wanted Carthage to end. And the contemporary historian Polybius tells us that not only did Rome want this to happen, but they'd wanted it to happen for some time, or at least a faction in the Senate had wanted this, embodied in particular by a very cantankerous fellow, Cato the Elder, who idealizes a sort of past that possibly never was about Rome. So he legendarily ends every speech saying, Carthage must be destroyed. That is sometimes rendered in today as Carthago delenda est, but we only have the only historians who tell us about it are in Greek, and they use a different phrase, which is Carthage should not be, the way they render it. So on the one hand, it seems to fit with the traditional model of Roman behavior, which is someone has defied Rome, insulted Rome's honor, existimatio, by breaking the treaty with them. So Rome is reacting to that, as they do. But on the other hand, there is that Carthage capitulates. They do everything Rome says. On the other hand, there is the fact that Rome persists in this, what appears to be a determination to destroy Carthage, and has had that long before the treaty breach exists. So this is being driven by other factors in addition to those usual motivations for such violence, which are retribution and exemplarity, if you will, making an example of someone to deter others, conspicuous destruction. So it both does and does not fit the mold, if you will. Now, if we fast forward 300 years, so from 146 BCE to the mid-3rd century CE, we find Rome in a crisis, the Roman Empire in a crisis it has never faced before. This crisis is both external. They're under constant pressure from invasions across their main northern borders on the Rhine and the Danube. They're having difficulty expelling the people who invade, whereas previously, if such invasions happened, they were short-lived and easily repulsed. And they're also under pressure in the east from the Persians, who have supplanted the Parthians as Rome's eastern neighbor across the Euphrates, who are invading deep into what they called Asia Minor, what we would now call Turkey. So Rome is having this military crisis. At the same time, it is having a deep political crisis. where there is this a lot of what we call usurpers, people who rise up in rebellion against the emperor, some of whom form at times breakaway empires. So Gaul, Spain, and Britain are controlled by someone different from the person who's ruling in Rome, and we find the Eastern Empire is broken away as well. Eventually, this is brought back together, but you have this prolonged feeling of crisis prompts several emperors to believe what's gone wrong is we've lost the support of the gods. So the gods who've supported the empire all this time, we've lost their support. Why is that? Or how do we restore that? And it begins with a couple of emperors who issue things requiring everyone to sacrifice in the empire. And if you don't sacrifice, it's on pain of death. And of course, this catches people like the Christians in particular, who cannot sacrifice. Those ones are very short-lived in the mid-3rd century. But towards the end, when we have an emperor, Diocletian, who to a large extent restores the stability of the empire, he divides the empire in 4 effectively. There are now 4 emperors rather than 1 to try to manage everything. This is when we have the Great Persecution, as it's known. This again is a bit more intense. It has destruction of churches, it is burning of books, as well as the requirement that everyone sacrifice. And it seems to be intimately connected with this idea of restoring the gods' support for the Roman Empire and for the Roman emperors in particular. And at the same time, as the Christians who get sort of the most focus in the sources, another group, the Manichaeans, are also subject to a similar sort of persecution. And they are very intimately connected with or seen to be connected with the Persian Empire, at the time are causing Rome a lot of grief, if you will, on the eastern frontier. So you've got, on the one hand, with Carthage, this question of the empire's reputation, but at the same time, I think some other things bubbling away under the surface. And with the Christians, you have this idea that the Roman Empire is buttressed by the consensus of the gods. It's been lost somehow. We need to restore it. We need everyone to sacrifice for the well-being of the empire. There are these groups who won't do that. Maybe they're the cause of the loss of the divine support. Sorry, it's quite a long answer, but I'm not sure it can be a lot more compact.
It was a very big question. So that really, I think, kind of sets us up for a bit of a drill down into some of these in just a second. But before we do that, since we're talking about genocide, we need to make a little diversion, of course, to talk about this highly contested, sometimes politically charged concept. So could you tell the audience a bit about what genocide is and how it emerged?
Yes, well, what genocide is a contested term. So if one looks in a standard textbook, one will find over 20 definitions.
Yes. In one particular textbook, there's like a 2-page thing with all the definitions in one place.
Yeah. So if anyone wants to, Adam Jones, Genocide, A Comprehensive Introduction, I think he compiles all the definitions that he's aware of there and has that nice table. In its origin, though, we go back actually before the Second World War. And we can identify a very specific creator of the concept in a Polish jurist named Raphael Lemkin. And before World War II, he's a very keen student of history. And he has in mind initially such a treatment of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire and other historical examples as well. And he tries to have enshrined in international law 2 crimes, barbarism and vandalism. One is the destruction of a people, and the other is the destruction of their culture. So destroying sacred texts, destroying places of worship or other places or other aspects of social practice that are constitutive of a group. And so that's his initial conception. And then as World War II evolves, during World War II, he publishes a book called
Axis Rule and
Axis
Occupied
Powers.
Europe.
Yeah.
Yes.
The Axis Powers in Occupied Europe, in which he proclaims the term genocide, which he defines essentially as a systematic attack on a particular group. Not only the biological continuity, but the various social practices as well. And he uses as his example, of course, the actions of the Axis powers. And after World War II, he pushes for the creation of an international crime of genocide. And it's used by one of the prosecutors as a term in the Nuremberg trials, although generally speaking, that's not. It's crimes against humanity. That is the term that is used there. And this leads to the Convention on the Prevention of the Crime of Genocide in the late 1940s. And interestingly, in the preamble to that convention, it recognizes or states that this is a crime that has been in existence for a long period of history. And it's actually a post-1940s development, the idea that genocide is a particular product of modernity. But in that convention, which is, if we want to think about definitions that are widely accepted, this is really the one that, if you will, matters. Because all the other ones, all the sociological definitions that we find, while they address various shortcomings of this legal definition, owe their origin and derivative from this particular one. And this is the one that matters when international political discourse. And that essentially defines genocide as certain acts, killing, imposing conditions of life that will lead to death, transferring people between one group and another. Says all of these are acts that are committed with an intention to destroy an ethnic, national, religious, racial group as such. So it's acts, essentially it's the intentional destruction of a group of people as a group of people is what genocide is. And there are various arguments that exist about what those groups should be. So should we include social groups, which aren't included in the definition? Should we include political groups that aren't included in the UN Convention definition? Should we include things other than biological destruction? So Lemkin originally imagined attacks on culture as an essential component of genocide, but the convention itself focuses purely on killing people killing the people or destroying the people, genetic destruction, if you will. Should we include what is sometimes called cultural genocide in that? And that's where the other definitions expand and conflate. So some are much stricter than the UN Convention in only focusing on killing. So the UN Convention includes other things. Most are more expansive in terms of the groups of people that they would include in genocide. But the essential nature is the destruction of a group of people as a group of people. So the reason they're being destroyed is because they are members of that group, rather than, there can be additional reasons. You can be targeting that group for different reasons. The convention is completely agnostic on why you want that group to be destroyed. Some more recent definitions try to constrain that. They try to say it should be for an ideological purpose, for example. But the convention is agnostic as to that. So that's where it comes from. It emerges from the wake of World War II. But in terms of its intellectual history, its founder imagines it as a transhistorical phenomenon. And indeed, he started writing but did not finish a history of genocide. That would include chapters on Carthage, I believe, and Gaul and the treatment of the Christians and other historical events as well. But we've only got his notes on that.
That's great. That's great, Tristan. And one of the themes that emerges from your discussion, very clear and really gripping, of the expansion of Rome, the place and applicability of the idea of genocide to some of Rome's interactions, the requirements of obedience that Rome asks of its conquered peoples, is a deep sense of the division between Rome on the one hand and these other groups as simply foreign on the other. But I wonder if you could talk about one feature of Rome that I think may surprise some of our contemporary listeners, is the simultaneous radical openness that Rome had to inclusion, to military, political participation of individuals from these groups. So rather than this strict separation, we have simultaneously this inclusion and openness rather than just exclusion. So could you just say a little bit about how these two elements of Rome can exist together?
Yes, it is fascinating that Rome is an extremely, perhaps one of the most pluralist empires there have been. So at Rome, if you were a slave, you could be freed, and if you were freed, you became a citizen. And there were some constrictions on your rights, but your children would be unconstrained. They would be full citizens, no matter what your origin had been as a slave. And although the process is slow, gradually the political participation in the very elite echelons of the Roman Empire, so the Roman Senate, and even the Roman Emperor himself, gets expanded out throughout the empire. So you have emperors from Spain, you have emperors from North Africa, you end up with an emperor from Arabia. So Rome is, in a way that, for example, Athens was not, is a much more open society, open to expansion, open to expanding its citizen base. And for a long time offers citizenship as an incentive to elites to help run the empire for Rome. And eventually in the early 3rd century gives citizenship to pretty much everyone within the empire. So you have that on the one hand. That doesn't mean that there aren't cultural conflicts, cultural anxieties among the elite at the expansion. When Caesar wants to enfranchise people from newly conquered Gaul, there is some resistance in the Roman Senate to this notion in the 1st century BCE. But alongside this openness, nonetheless, Rome is very capable of identifying peoples and groups of peoples as other, if you will, in scare quotes, and separating them out. So if one reads, a great example here is there's a geographer named Strabo writing in the 1st century BCE. And he writes about all does a tour of the Mediterranean, writing about them. And throughout, a constant theme is the contrast between those who live in the plains and those who live in cities, and those who live in the hills. And those who live in the plains and those in the cities are peace-loving, wonderful, civilized people. And those who live in the hills are barbarians and scary people. And these contrasts exist. So Rome is capable of identifying groups as other. It doesn't have the same sort of overtones we associate with what we might call scientific racism, again in scare quotes, that we encounter in the modern period. It's very sort of pragmatic. There's nothing about these otherings that has a logic of destruction about them. These people are X, therefore these people have to be destroyed. But nonetheless, the Romans clearly have ideas of hierarchy associated very strongly with urbanism. and we find that a lot in interactions with people on the margins of the empire. Doesn't quite apply to Carthage, which was a very it's not a, and indeed we find this with most societies and the way they other and the way they inflict mass violence. There's not actually a very good logic to it all. You find it's often hypocritical and idiosyncratic and self-contradictory and so on. So the way they identify Carthage and come down on it, and the stereotypes and so on that they use about Carthage aren't to do with that urban, civilized, hill barbarian divide. It's something different. But this acceptance does not exclude intolerance, if you will.
That's fantastic.
The two exist all the time there together.
Okay, thank you, Tristan. So why do you think Rome felt the need to eliminate Carthage when other imperial competitors to Rome, such as the Persians, which you've mentioned, were not? So why is Cato the Elder, or his equivalents, not similarly calling for the destruction of other adversaries to Rome?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting constellation of factors that come together. So I think a key component is the Second Punic War, Hannibal rampaging through Italy, and the psychological impact that had on Rome. So the Carthaginians are viewed as cruel and untrustworthy. That these labels could be applied to the Romans as well is irrelevant. And that lingers, that the Carthaginians cannot be trusted. So the Romans have a saying, punica fides, Punic good faith, which is essentially the opposite. It's completely untrustworthy. So the Carthaginians have that stereotype attached to them. And that the Persians don't have at this time, or the Parthians don't have at this time, and won't really acquire until ever, in fact, which I think goes into... we were talking about Roman prejudices, and one of them is that people from the East, which would include the Persians, are viewed as somehow soft and a bit weak, not trustworthy. And this kind of prejudice leads to many horrendously misguided enterprises where the Romans try to conquer Persia and lose because they have this stereotype about the East being weak. But I think what it is with Carthage is that they have this memory of humiliation at the hands of Carthage. They have this stereotype of the Carthaginians in particular as untrustworthy, as cruel, and this idea that lingers not amongst everyone, so there are opponents to this, that as long as Carthage stands, Rome will never be safe. And Rome never really develops that idea about anyone else. And I think it's because until the late empire, no one ever really challenges Rome like Carthage did. So I think that is what is, and we have some fragments of speeches given by Cato to the Senate, urging them to destroy Carthage. And those are the kind of ideas that linger there, that Carthage can't be trusted.
Thank you. And you've talked earlier about Gaul, so as a sort of another potential example, so Caesar's Gallic Wars. What role do you see violence playing within Rome's management of its empire? And so within that, how unusual are these wars of elimination within Rome's control of its possessions?
So wars of elimination are relatively rare, and that's because the whole way the Roman Empire functions is that Rome will exploit local elites to manage the empire for them. They're not interested. It's not Lebensraum. It's not like the Nazi Third Reich Empire. They're not driving people out to implant Romans. Certainly that happens a bit more often actually in Italy, interestingly enough. There are some sort of expulsion things that happen in North Italy And yes, they do settle colonia, which is where we get the word colony from, in conquered territories. But that's not the main game. The main way the Romans control their empire is through co-opting local elites. So it's not in their interest to eliminate people because they want to exploit them for taxes and resources. So they're relatively rare. And when we find these things happening in Caesar, for example, so there are, I think, 3 main events where that have this sort of eliminationist aspect. 2 of them are directed towards tribes of people, Germanic tribes of people from the north of the Rhine, where he crosses the Rhine. He makes a big deal about it. He has a very extraordinarily long description of a bridge that he builds, if you're interested in descriptions of bridges. But he's not really interested in establishing Rome beyond the Rhine. And Andrew Rixby has argued in a very good book that he tries to categorize the Germans as in fact unsuitable for incorporation within the empire. And when he describes the Germans, he describes them through negative description. So everything the Germans are not. So they do not farm. They do not do this. They do not do that. In other words, they do not do anything that we do. And they don't like authority, so they're not really very good as slaves. So that's where most of his eliminationist violence happens, is against these peoples, very heavily identified as other, in an area he's not interested in conquering. He's interested in displaying Roman power, but he's not interested in incorporation in the way that he is in Gaul. So it's a very different dynamic to what happens in relation to Carthage, I think. Although Carthage also is, the city is demolished, the land is cursed, so they're not interested in incorporating that in the empire either. It's a very symbolic act of destruction that we know actually resonated throughout the Mediterranean. The contemporary Polybius, it's great to have contemporaries, which happens so rarely, but he talks about how there are differential reactions. People are talking in the Mediterranean about the destruction of Carthage. Some say Rome was right to do it, and others say they weren't. So it's an very interesting piece of observation there.
Right.
Observation.
I think that's really great. And that takes us maybe to the case of the Christians and the Manichaeans, because one of the themes that you're also bringing out here is, on the one hand, a kind of deep stubbornness on the part of Rome, a kind of fixed sense of where the Carthaginians stand with regard to Rome, but then with regard to other peoples, a little bit more kind of flexibility. You're out right now, but you might be, you might be in, and maybe that's exemplified, or you can tell us a bit about that with the Christians in particular. This movement from out of the empire to the very religion of the emperor himself. So could you just tell us a little bit about how Christians and Manichaeans come to be on the outside, the objects of persecution, disdain, and then the great movement to being the greatest of insiders, the very religion of the emperor himself?
Yes, so the outsider is perhaps easier to explain than the insider part of that story. So because as the empire progresses, the connection between the emperor and the divine becomes more pronounced. And the emperor cult, more spread throughout the empire, a group of people who are new. The Romans hate new things. So their term for a revolution, right, isn't revolutio, which you think it would be. It's nova res, a new thing. Like a new thing is a terrible thing. So the Christians are new, whereas Jews who are also monotheistic have been there forever. So they've been there for a very long time. So they have this sort of antiquity supporting them. So the Romans are much more tolerant of Jews, whereas Christians are new. Christians proselytize in a way that Jews do not, and Christians do not sacrifice to the emperor. So it's easy to see how they end up on the outside.
Okay, but you said the story of how they end up on the inside is there, obviously there's a story to be told, but is there a kind of logic to Rome that explains it, or it's just idiosyncratic to Constantine?
I think that the logic, such as it is, we can root in religious thinking. So at the time, so for those unfamiliar with this story, the story of the transformation of Rome from a persecuting state to one where Christianity becomes the accepted religion of the elite has as its crux, its turning point, the Emperor Constantine, who in the traditional story has a revelation before he goes into battle. He sees a sign in the sky, around the sun. In this you will conquer. He has a dream where Christ appears to him. He gets his soldiers to paint a Christian symbol on their shield. They go into battle and they win, and henceforth Constantine is the supporter of Christianity. And gradually the empire, through his sons and following on, becomes Christianized as well, with the support from the emperor. The logic that supports that is this idea that goes back, in fact, to the very foundation of the empire itself, with the idea that the gods are supporting the empire. That is why Rome is successful. Our crisis is because the gods have stopped supporting us. So Constantine has his vision. He goes into battle under the sign of the Christian God, and he wins. Well, that must mean that the Christian God is the God that's the important God, and is the one that will ensure my success. And he keeps winning. So he not only beats Maxentius, the person who's then controlling Rome, even though Rome is more symbolic than an actual political capital now. Eventually he'll fight a war in the east against another one of his co-emperors, Licinius. He'll win that as well. And he'll be the first emperor to unite the empire for about 40 years under one rule. So he's got all this success that suggests this God is his support and is the right God to be behind him. So that's the logic that dictates it. The sort of question that remains and perhaps can never be answered is, why did Constantine pick Christianity when it was, at that stage, it was under persecution? Less so in the western part of the Roman world, which is where Constantine was, so Spain, Gaul, Italy, and so on. It was more vigorously prosecuted in the east, Greece, Turkey, the Levant, and so on. So why did he pick that? Did he really have a vision? This is something we'll never, unless we can interview him, which of course we can't, we'll never really know. But that's the story he told. That was his explanation. But there's actually a long history of tropes of emperors having visions and then having success. So the way that the story is told actually fits with a traditional narrative. Does it mean the narrative is wrong? We don't know, but that is the intriguing question I think we can't answer.
That's very good. One quick follow-up about the relationship between Christians and Manichaeans, and the only place that I know the Manichaeans from is from Augustine's Confessions, and the way that he speaks about the Manichaeans, as I'm sure you know, is as a kind of false church, but as if they were Christians, or at least that's how I read it. Was Augustine's view Manichaeans as a kind of false Christians, or he comes to realize as false Christians? Was that a widely held view, or is that a view that's particular to Augustine, and maybe Augustine looking back on his own journey to Catholicism?
Yeah, I don't. So he's speaking from a Christian perspective. So that may well be the Christian perspective. So you have the Figomani, you have conflict between good and evil. That's very much part of Manichaeism. But I think from the perspective of non-Christians, Manichaeism it's not the problem with it isn't it's a false form of Christianity. It's this other new strange religion closely connected in Roman eyes with the Persian Empire, which is the problematic aspect of it. That sets it apart from traditional religion and associates it with one of Rome's chief opponents. So I think the Augustine perspective wouldn't have been the reason, for example, Diocletian first turned on the Manichaeans, and then, because when we look at the persecution, the Manichaeans come first, and then the Christians are the target of Diocletian's persecution.
That's great. Well, it's always good to keep in mind who is talking and their own particular projects when they are relating history to us.
So when we think about the attack on the Christians and the Manichaeans by the Romans, you suggest that this mostly took the form of cultural destruction and execution. Why was it that Rome chose these particular methods of group destruction?
Well, I think Rome, given the motivation for what they were doing, which was we want everyone to be, on board, sacrificing for the empire, that if actually every Christian had just said, okay, I'll sacrifice now, then they didn't necessarily have an interest in destroying them as a group. So in that sense, it was very different from the Holocaust, where there's nothing a Jewish person could do. A Jewish person couldn't convert to avert being killed or sent into hard labor or whatever other terrible thing the Nazis had in mind for that particular person. So it's different from that, but because the practice was so antithetical to what the Romans wanted, then destroying the churches and the books and everything was an essential component of removing that group. So the first focus was on removing the practices constitutive of the group, and then the last phase was trying to ensure that they sacrificed for the good of the empire.
So would you say here then that there are sort of qualitative differences between methods of destruction and motivations for that destruction between ancient and modern genocides, or are there some points of similarity between the two of them?
I think there are points of similarity you can see. But not necessarily across every instance. So I think, for example, in relation to the destruction of Carthage, you can see a number of touch points with modern genocides. So there is the aspect of humiliation that the Romans felt at the hands of the Carthaginians, which is a strong feature amongst a number of genocides. You find that in the Holocaust. You find that in Rwanda as well. And there is the feeling of existential anxiety that you get with Carthage, get with the Christians as well. And with Carthage, you have another anxiety that's bubbling away beneath the surface as well, which is about cultural change within the empire. So Rome is changing rapidly as a result, particularly of contact with not so much with Carthage, but with the Greek East, the Greek-speaking East. It's bringing a lot of cultural change. It's bringing a lot of affluence to Rome. that sit uneasily with Rome's vision of itself as an austere society focused on citizen farmers. Now, you've got people with an awful lot of money who aren't ploughing the field and then going off to fight. They're living in lives of luxury, and that causes some existential angst. So you've got concern about societal change bubbling away beneath the surface as well, although the target of that is not the perceived cause of that change. So in the relation to Carthage, you see these touch points with modern motivations. In relation to the other, so we talked briefly about Milos, we talked about Caesar in Gaul. There's a little more distance, I think, because a lot of those factors you find in modern instances aren't there. You certainly have some prejudice of some form, which is a key component of genocide, but you have less sense of existential angst associated with it. It's much more muted. There is always the lingering idea that if you don't respond with force to insults the emperor's reputation, it's going to bring about disaster. But I think it's much more muted in other instances than it is in relation to Carthage. And in relation to the Christians, again, you have the idea that it can be avoided. It's not seen as somehow inherent in the people. So their destruction can be avoided if only they do what we want them to do, which is, this is not an affordance given to the Tutsi. It's not an affordance given to Jewish or Romani people, but it is something that is afforded there. So you can draw a Venn diagram and create overlaps. But there are also differentiations as well, which is not surprising given the millennia of difference between and cultural change that has happened between the periods of time.
Exactly. So we are basically at the end of our time, and so I just want to conclude just very quickly in just a few sentences with one final question. What is the biggest misconception about mass violence in the ancient Western world that you would like to dispel for our listeners?
Well, I think there are two. I can be quick. One is that the genocide did happen. There is intentional group destruction. The second point is that although mass violence could be celebrated, as the destruction of Carthage was, and Christians were, execution were a matter of public display, nonetheless, it did create enough of a feeling of concern that they felt a need to justify it. It wasn't taken as a matter of course. So I've already mentioned the example of Carthage and the different reactions to it. And the reason the Romans didn't just destroy Carthage, Polybius makes clear, is they were waiting for a pretext, something they thought would justify the destruction of the city in the wider view of the world in which they lived. And Polybius tells us that some people bought the Roman justification and other people did not. So, and with the destruction of the Christians as well, there was a need to justify this. So it could, it's not just a matter of course.
Well, that is an excellent place to end our discussion. Thank you so much, Tristan, for joining us. It's been a great conversation, and we really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Tristan. Great conversation.
Thanks, Tristan.
Tristan Taylor will be here at the University of Calgary on June 9th and 10th, 2023, for our Oddities of Violence workshop, made possible through funding by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. If you want to know more about Tristan's work on Rome's turn to genocidal violence, drop by the workshop in person or watch it live streamed. Details will be on our Oddities of Violence website. You have been listening to the Oddities of Violence podcast. Our podcast is produced and edited by Alejandra Vivas. Thank you so much, Alejandra, with support from the great team at CJSW. Join us for our next episode when we turn to oddities of violence in the modern era. We'll be looking again at the margins of genocide, but this time in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s. We'll be looking at how and why starvation was central to that genocide. Our guest then will be James Tyner from Kent State University in Ohio in the United States. Your host will be me again, Maureen Hebert. Thanks for listening, everyone. Until next time.